The words hit me like a slap across the face, on what should have been the happiest day of my life. You're not my real daughter anyway, so why should I care about your wedding? My mother's voice was ice cold as she stood in the bridal suite, her arms crossed, watching me struggle with the buttons on my wedding dress. The other bridesmaids had stepped out to give us privacy, thinking we needed a mother-daughter moment. Instead, I got the truth that shattered 25 years of my life in a single sentence. I stared at her reflection in the mirror, my hands frozen on the delicate pearl buttons that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. What did you say? The words barely made it past the tightness in my throat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My mother, Patricia Collins, stood behind me in her expensive navy suit, her perfectly styled gray hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the boutique's windows. She looked elegant, composed, everything a mother of the bride should be. Except for her eyes, which held no warmth, no love, just a cold satisfaction at having finally delivered a blow she'd been saving for years. You heard me, Sarah, she said, my name dripping with disdain. All these years, playing the perfect daughter, trying so hard to earn my approval. It was pathetic, really. You're not even mine. She moved closer, and I could smell her expensive perfume, the same Chanel No. 5 she'd worn my entire life. Your real mother was some homeless drug addict who died when you were 3. I only took you in because the state was paying good money for foster care back then. The room spun around me. 25 years of memories crashed through my mind like broken glass. Every birthday she'd seemed irritated to celebrate. Every achievement she'd dismissed with a shrug. Every time I'd wondered why I felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own home, desperately trying to be good enough, smart enough, worthy enough of her love. Now I knew why I'd always felt like an outsider looking in at my own life. That's not true, I whispered, though even as I said it, pieces of my childhood were clicking into place with horrible clarity. The way she'd never wanted to answer questions about when I was born. How there were no baby pictures of me in our house, just school photos starting from when I was about 4. The cold distance I'd attributed to her just being a reserved person. Patricia laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. Oh, it's true. Check the records if you want. Sarah Michelle Williams, ward of the state, until I stupidly thought taking care of a damaged little girl might fill the hole your father left when he walked out. Turns out, you were just as much of a disappointment as he was. I couldn't breathe. My wedding dress, the one I'd saved for months to afford, felt like it was suffocating me. Through the window, I could see guests arriving at the small church across the street. My fiancé David would be waiting at the altar, probably wondering where I was. My bridesmaids would return any minute expecting to see a glowing bride ready for her big day. Instead, they'd find me falling apart at the seams. My entire identity crumbling around me like a house of cards in a hurricane. Why are you telling me this now? I managed to ask, my voice cracking. On my wedding day, her smile was cruel. Because you asked me to walk you down the aisle, since your father isn't here. Well, guess what? I'm not your real mother, so I don't owe you anything. Especially not some sentimental moment you'll treasure forever. She straightened her jacket with deliberate precision. I'll stay for the ceremony since people are expecting me, but don't expect any tearful speeches or mother-daughter dances. The door opened and my maid of honor, Jessica, peeked in. Hey, you two ready? The photographer wants to get some shots before we head over. She took one look at my face and rushed to my side. Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Patricia smoothed down her hair and picked up her purse. Just pre-wedding jitters, she said smoothly. I'll see you at the church. She walked out without another word, leaving me drowning in the wreckage of everything I thought I knew about myself. Sarah, talk to me, Jessica said, grabbing my hands. What happened? I couldn't tell her. Not now, not here, not when 200 people were waiting to celebrate what was supposed to be the beginning of my new life. So I did what I'd learned to do after 25 years of living with Patricia Collins. I swallowed the pain, straightened my shoulders, and pretended everything was fine. I'm okay, I lied, reaching for my lipstick with shaking hands. Just nervous. Let's get these pictures done. The wedding passed in a blur. I walked down the aisle alone, having told everyone at the last minute that Patricia wasn't feeling well enough to escort me. David looked concerned when he saw me approaching by myself, but I gave him what I hoped was a reassuring smile. We said our vows, exchanged rings, and kissed as husband and wife while everyone cheered. Through it all, I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold, disconnected from my own body. Patricia sat in the front row throughout the ceremony, playing the role of proud mother perfectly. She smiled at the right moments, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue during the vows, and accepted congratulations from other guests with gracious humility. No one would have guessed that hours earlier, she'd destroyed her daughter's world with casual cruelty. At the reception, she made a beautiful toast about watching me grow into a strong, independent woman, and how proud she was to call me her daughter. The irony burned in my chest, as everyone raised their glasses and applauded. I sat at the head table, my new husband's hand in mine, surrounded by love and celebration, and felt more alone than I ever had in my entire life. "You seem distant tonight," David whispered during our first dance. "Everything okay?" I looked into his kind brown eyes, the eyes that had fallen in love with me believing I was Sarah Collins, daughter of Patricia and the late Robert Collins. How could I tell him that the woman he'd married might not even be the person he thought she was? How could I explain that I didn't know who I was anymore? "Just overwhelmed," I said, resting my head against his chest. "It's been a long day." We danced to At Last by Etta James, the song we'd chosen because it represented finding each other after years of bad relationships and false starts. But as David spun me around the dance floor, all I could think about was how everything in my life had been built on lies. My name might not even be real. My entire history was a fabrication. The party went on until nearly midnight. Patricia stayed until the end, playing her role flawlessly. She hugged me goodbye and wished David and me a wonderful honeymoon, her performance so convincing that several guests commented on what a lovely relationship we had. If I hadn't known better, I would have believed it myself. David and I spent our wedding night in the honeymoon suite at the Grand Hotel downtown. He fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the long day, and probably a few too many champagne toasts with his groomsmen. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to answer. Who was I really? What happened to my biological parents? How much of what Patricia had told me was true, and how much was just another way to hurt me? The next morning, we flew to Hawaii for our honeymoon. David had saved up for a year to afford the trip, wanting to give us the perfect romantic getaway. Under normal circumstances, I would have been thrilled. I'd never been anywhere more exotic than the next state over. But I spent our first days in paradise, feeling like I was living someone else's life. David noticed, of course. He was too observant, and loved me too much not to see that something was wrong. On our third night, as we sat on the beach watching the sunset, he finally confronted me about it. "Talk to me, Sarah," he said, taking my hand in his. "You've been somewhere else this entire trip. Did I do something wrong? Are you having second thoughts about us?" The concern in his voice almost broke me. Here was this wonderful man who loved me completely, and I was ruining our honeymoon, because I couldn't stop obsessing over Patricia's revelation, but I also couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. I needed time to process it myself first. "No, of course not," I said quickly. "I love you. I love being married to you. I guess I'm just having trouble adjusting to everything being different now." He seemed to accept that explanation, though I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. We spent the rest of our honeymoon trying to recapture the joy we should have been feeling. David was patient and loving, planning romantic dinners and adventures around the island. I did my best to be present, to enjoy our time together, but Patricia's words echoed in my mind constantly. When we returned home to our small apartment in Portland, Oregon, I threw myself into research. While David was at work at the engineering firm, where he'd just been promoted to project manager, I spent hours online searching for any information I could find about Sarah Michelle Williams. What I discovered made Patricia's story seem increasingly plausible. There was indeed a record of a Sarah Michelle Williams, who had been placed in foster care in Oregon in 1998 at the age of 3. The sparse details available showed that her biological mother, Linda Williams, had died of a drug overdose, and there was no father listed on any documentation. The child had been placed with Patricia Collins, a recently divorced woman, who had applied to be a foster parent. But the trail went cold after that. I couldn't find any record of an official adoption, which struck me as strange. If Patricia had wanted to make me legally her daughter, wouldn't there be paperwork? I also couldn't find any information about what had happened to Linda Williams before her death, or whether I had any other biological family members who might still be alive. The more I dug, the more questions I had. I started visiting government offices during my lunch breaks, trying to get access to sealed records. As an adult, I should have been able to request information about my own case, but I kept running into bureaucratic walls. Files were sealed, transferred, or mysteriously unavailable. It was as if someone had deliberately made it difficult to trace my origins. 3 months after my wedding, I finally worked up the courage to confront Patricia directly. I drove to her house, a modest 2-story in the suburbs, where I'd grown up, on a Saturday morning when I knew she'd be home. She answered the door in her gardening clothes, soil under her fingernails from working in the rose bushes that were her pride and joy. "Sarah," she said, not bothering to hide her irritation at seeing me. "What do you want?" "We need to talk," I said, pushing past her into the living room, where I'd spent countless hours of my childhood trying to be invisible. "About what you told me on my wedding day." She sighed, and pulled off her gardening gloves. "I was wondering when you'd work up the nerve to come back here. What is it you want to know?" "Everything," I said, sitting down on the couch without being invited. "I want to know about Linda Williams. I want to know how you ended up with me. I want to know why you never legally adopted me if you were planning to raise me as your own daughter." Patricia sat down across from me, her posture rigid. For a moment I thought she might refuse to answer, but then she seemed to decide that the time for secrets had passed. "Fine," she said. "You want the truth. Linda Williams was a junkie who showed up at my door when you were 3 years old, half dead from withdrawal, and claiming I was her emergency contact. Apparently she'd listed me on some form years earlier, when we briefly lived in the same apartment building. I barely remembered her, but there she was with this scared, dirty little girl, who hadn't eaten in days. My chest tightened as I tried to imagine myself at 3 years old, hungry and frightened, watching strangers decide my fate. Linda begged me to take you for just a few days, while she got clean. She promised she'd come back for you, that she just needed time to get her life together." Patricia's voice was flat, emotionless, as if she were reading from a grocery list. "I should have called social services immediately, but you were so small and scared. Against my better judgment, I let her leave you with me. What happened to her?" "She overdosed 2 weeks later in some flophouse downtown. By then I'd already contacted the state about you. They were grateful to have a foster placement ready to go, and the monthly stipend helped with my bills after Robert left." She looked at me with something that might have been regret, though it was hard to tell. "I thought maybe having a child would give me purpose, help me move on from my divorce. I was wrong." The words stung, even though I'd expected them. "So you kept me for the money?" "At first, yes," she admitted, "but I genuinely tried to be a good mother to you. For a while anyway. You were such a needy child, always crying, always clinging to me, always asking questions about your real mother that I couldn't answer. It was exhausting. I remembered being a clingy child, desperate for Patricia's attention and approval. Now I understood why. I'd been grieving a loss I couldn't even name, searching for the maternal love that had been ripped away from me when Linda died. Why didn't you adopt me officially?" Patricia looked uncomfortable for the first time since our conversation began. "The state kept pushing for it, especially after you'd been with me for a few years. But adoption is permanent. Once you legally adopt a child, you can't give them back if things don't work out. I wasn't ready for that kind of commitment." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. For 22 years, I'd lived in Patricia's house knowing, on some level, that my place there was precarious. I'd sensed that I had to constantly prove my worth, that one mistake could result in me being sent away. Now I knew why.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Because Patricia had always kept that option open. "So I was never really your daughter," I said quietly, "even legally." "No," she said, "you were my foster child. I received payments for your care until you turned 18. After that, you were on your own, though I let you stay until you finished college since you were paying rent." I thought about those college years, working 2 jobs to pay Patricia rent for the tiny room in the basement while also covering tuition and expenses. I'd been so grateful that she was letting me stay, so afraid of being thrown out that I'd never complained about the cramped conditions or the way she treated me more like a tenant than a family member. "Do you have any other information about Linda?" I asked. "Family members who might still be alive, medical history, anything?" Patricia shrugged. "Not really. She mentioned having a sister once, but I don't know her name or where she lived. As for medical history, all I know is that drug addiction runs in your family, obviously." She said it so casually, as if my biological mother's struggles were a character flaw rather than a disease. As if the trauma that had shaped my earliest years was just another inconvenience for her to deal with. I left Patricia's house that day with more questions than answers, but also with a strange sense of relief. At least now I knew why I'd always felt like I didn't belong. Why Patricia's love had always felt conditional and fragile, why I'd spent my entire life trying to be perfect enough to earn something that was never really available to me in the first place. David noticed the change in me immediately. I was quieter, more withdrawn, spending hours researching my biological family online and making phone calls to various agencies and records offices. When he asked what was wrong, I finally told him everything. To my surprise and gratitude, his reaction was nothing like what I'd feared. "I don't care what your name was before or who your biological parents were," he said, pulling me into his arms. "You're my wife, you're the woman I fell in love with. Nothing about that changes." His acceptance meant everything to me, but it also highlighted how different his unconditional love was from what I'd experienced with Patricia. David loved me for who I was, not for how well I performed or how much I could give him. It was a revelation that made me realize just how damaged my understanding of love had become. Over the following months, I slowly began to piece together fragments of my biological mother's life. I found a former neighbor who remembered Linda Williams as a sweet girl who'd gotten involved with the wrong crowd. I tracked down a social worker who had handled my case briefly and who provided me with a few more details about the circumstances that had led to my placement with Patricia. What emerged was a picture of a young woman who had struggled with addiction but who had genuinely loved me. Linda had named me Sarah after her own grandmother, and according to the few people who remembered her, she had talked about me constantly during her brief periods of sobriety. She had wanted to get clean, to be a good mother, but she had been fighting demons that ultimately proved stronger than her love for me. I found her grave in a city cemetery, a small headstone marked simply Linda Williams, 1975 to 1998, beloved daughter. Someone had been caring for it over the years, leaving fresh flowers and keeping the grass trimmed. When I asked the cemetery office who had been maintaining the plot, they gave me a name that made my heart race. Margaret Williams turned out to be Linda's older sister, my biological aunt, who lived just 2 hours away in Salem. When I called her, she burst into tears at hearing my voice. "Sarah," she whispered. "Oh my God, Sarah. I've been looking for you for 25 years. We arranged to meet the following weekend at a coffee shop halfway between our two cities." I was nervous as I drove there, wondering what she would be like, whether she would want a relationship with me, whether she would be disappointed in who I'd become. But the moment I walked into the coffee shop and saw the woman sitting alone at a corner table, I knew I'd found family. Margaret Williams was in her early 50s, with graying brown hair and kind eyes that looked remarkably like my own. She stood up when she saw me, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch my face. "You look just like her," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Just like Linda when she was your age." We sat and talked for 4 hours, and I learned more about my biological family in that one conversation than I had discovered in months of research. Margaret told me about Linda's struggles with addiction, but also about her talents, her dreams, her fierce love for me during the brief time we'd had together. "She tried so hard to get clean when she found out she was pregnant with you," Margaret said. "She went to rehab 3 times during her pregnancy, and she was sober for almost 2 years after you were born. You were the light of her life, Sarah. She carried your picture everywhere and talked about you constantly." "What happened?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer. Margaret's face crumpled with grief that was still fresh after all these years. She got involved with a man who was bad news. He got her using again, and once she started, she couldn't stop. I tried to help, tried to get her into treatment, but she disappeared with you one day, and I didn't see her again until it was too late. She took me with her when she was using. For a while, yes, I think she was trying to protect you from her boyfriend, who was becoming increasingly violent. But she was also spiraling out of control. The last time I saw her, she was skeletal, paranoid, barely coherent. I begged her to let me take you, but she was terrified that if she gave you up, she'd never get you back. Margaret reached across the table and took my hand. I want you to know that I never stopped looking for you. After Linda died, I tried to find out what had happened to you, but the state wouldn't tell me anything. They said foster placements were confidential, that I had no legal standing as your aunt. I hired a private investigator, but Patricia Collins seemed to have covered her tracks well. You knew about Patricia. I found out her name eventually, but I could never get an address or phone number. It was as if you'd both disappeared into thin air. I never gave up hope though. I kept that cemetery plot maintained all these years, hoping that someday you might come looking for Linda and find me instead. Meeting Margaret felt like finding a missing piece of myself. She showed me photos of Linda as a child and teenager, stories of their childhood growing up in a loving but chaotic household with their single mother who had worked 3 jobs to support them. She told me about Linda's artistic talents, her love of music, her dreams of becoming a teacher before drugs derailed her life. She would be so proud of you, Margaret said as we prepared to leave that day. A college graduate, married to a good man, building a life for yourself despite everything you went through. That's all she ever wanted for you. Margaret and I began meeting regularly, slowly building the aunt-niece relationship that had been stolen from us. She introduced me to other family members, cousins and relatives who welcomed me with open arms and shared more stories about Linda and our family history. For the first time in my life, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. David was wonderful through all of this, encouraging me to explore my newfound family connections and celebrating each new discovery with me. He came with me to family gatherings and holiday celebrations, fitting in seamlessly with people who shared my genes and my sense of humor in ways that Patricia never had. But as I grew closer to my biological family, my relationship with Patricia deteriorated further. She seemed threatened by my connection to Margaret and the others, making snide comments about people who live in the past and warning me about getting too attached to strangers who don't really know you. The final breaking point came during Christmas dinner, that first year after I'd found my biological family. David and I had invited both Patricia and Margaret, hoping they could coexist peacefully for one evening. Instead, Patricia spent the entire meal making passive-aggressive comments about people who abandon children and how grateful I should be for the real family who had raised me. At least I was there when it mattered, Patricia said when Margaret mentioned a funny story about Linda's childhood. I'm the one who fed her, clothed her, sent her to school, paid for her college. Blood doesn't make you family. Actions do. The irony was staggering. Patricia, who had kept me as a foster child for the monthly payments, and who had never legally adopted me because she wanted to keep her options open, was lecturing my biological aunt about family commitment. You're right, I said quietly, setting down my fork. Actions do make family, and your actions have shown me exactly where I stand with you. I stood up from the table, David immediately following my lead. Thank you for dinner, Patricia, but I think it's time we leave. As we walked to the car, I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time in my adult life, I had chosen to walk away from Patricia's toxicity instead of trying harder to win her approval. You okay? David asked as we drove home. Actually, yes, I said, and realized I meant it. I think I finally am. That was 3 years ago. Since then, David and I have built a beautiful life together, surrounded by my biological family, who love and accept me unconditionally. Margaret has become the mother figure I'd always craved, and my cousins feel more like siblings than Patricia ever felt like a parent. I've learned to cook Linda's favorite recipes, inherited some of her artistic abilities, and even found some of her old journals that Margaret had saved, giving me glimpses into the mind of the woman who gave me life. Patricia and I maintained minimal contact, exchanging holiday cards and the occasional phone call, but the relationship remained cold and distant. She made no effort to repair the damage between us, and I stopped trying to bridge a gap that had never really been crossable. I thought that was how things would remain between us forever. I was wrong. Last Tuesday morning, I was at work at the nonprofit where I manage community outreach programs, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Patricia's number, which was unusual. She never called me during work hours, and we rarely spoke except on birthdays and major holidays. "Hello, Patricia," I said, answering with the polite but distant tone we'd settled into over the years. "Sarah," her voice sounded different, strained in a way I'd never heard before. "I need to see you today, if possible. Is everything okay?" I asked, surprised by the urgency in her tone. There was a long pause. "No," she said finally, "everything is not okay. Can you come to the house after work?" Against my better judgment, curiosity won out. "I'll be there around 6. I spent the rest of the day wondering what could possibly be wrong enough to make Patricia reach out to me. We'd barely spoken in months, and our last conversation had been a perfunctory Christmas phone call, where we'd exchanged pleasantries and promised to stay in touch better, knowing neither of us meant it. David offered to come with me, but I decided to face whatever this was alone. I drove to Patricia's house that evening, with a mixture of dread and anticipation, unsure of what I would find when I got there. Patricia answered the door looking older than I'd ever seen her. Her usually perfect hair was unkempt, her clothes wrinkled, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading me into the living room where we'd had our confrontation about my biological family years earlier. "Please, sit down." I perched on the edge of the couch, ready to leave if this turned into another one of her verbal attacks. "What's going on, Patricia?" She sat down across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm sick, Sarah. Very sick. The doctors say I need a kidney transplant, and soon, or I'm going to die." The words hung in the air between us. I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. Patricia, who had always seemed invincible in her coldness, who had never shown vulnerability of any kind, was sitting in front of me admitting that she was dying. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. "That must be very frightening." "It is," she admitted, and for the first time in my memory, her voice cracked with genuine emotion. "I've been on the transplant list for 6 months, but the wait is long, and my condition is deteriorating faster than they expected." I waited for her to continue, sensing there was more she needed to say. "The doctors suggested I ask family members to be tested as potential donors," she went on. "Living donor transplants have better success rates and shorter wait times. The problem is you're the only family I have." The irony was breathtaking. The woman who had spent my entire life reminding me that I wasn't really her daughter, who had kept our relationship legal and emotional arm's length, was now asking me to literally give her a piece of my body to save her life. "I see," I said, my voice carefully neutral. Patricia leaned forward, and I saw desperation in her eyes that I'd never seen before. "I know I haven't been the best mother to you. I know I've made mistakes, said things I shouldn't have said. But Sarah, you're the only hope I have." I sat in stunned silence, my mind racing. Part of me felt a savage satisfaction at seeing Patricia in this position, finally needing something from me that she couldn't get anywhere else. After years of her treating me like an inconvenience, a burden she'd reluctantly carried, she was now literally dependent on my goodwill for her survival. But another part of me, the part that had spent 25 years desperately trying to earn her love, felt a familiar urge to help her, to finally be good enough to matter to her. Even after everything she'd put me through, some small voice in the back of my mind whispered that this might be my chance to prove my worth, to finally make her proud of me. "Have you been tested to see if I'm even a match?" I asked. "Not yet," she said. "I wanted to talk to you first, to see if you'd be willing to consider it. The testing process is extensive, and I didn't want to put you through it if you weren't open to the possibility." I appreciated that small courtesy, though I suspected it had more to do with her fear of rejection than any consideration for my feelings. "I need time to think about it," I said, "and I need to discuss it with David." Patricia nodded quickly. "Of course, take all the time you need." "Well, not all the time," she added with a weak attempt at humor. "The doctors say I have maybe 6 months without a transplant." I left her house that evening with my mind in turmoil. The drive home was a blur of conflicting emotions: anger, pity, confusion, and something that might have been grief for the relationship we'd never had, and now never would. David was waiting for me when I got home, takeout containers from our favorite Thai restaurant spread across the kitchen table. One look at my face told him that the evening hadn't gone well. "What happened?" he asked, pulling me into his arms. I told him everything, from Patricia's appearance to her diagnosis to her request. David listened without interrupting, his face growing more concerned as the story unfolded. "Wow," he said when I finished. "That's a lot to process. Tell me about it." I sat down at the table and picked at the pad thai he'd ordered for me, my appetite non-existent. "I don't know what to do, David. Part of me wants to help her, and part of me wants to tell her to go to hell." "Both of those reactions make sense," he said carefully. "What does your gut tell you?" I thought about it. My gut tells me that she doesn't deserve my help, that she spent my entire life making sure I knew I wasn't really her daughter, and now she wants to claim that relationship when it benefits her. "But," David prompted, sensing there was more, "but she's still the only mother I've ever known, even if she wasn't a good one. And I'm not sure I can live with myself if I let her die when I might be able to save her." David reached across the table and took my hand. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But remember, you don't owe her anything just because she kept you fed and housed. That was her legal obligation as your foster parent." "I know that logically," I said, "but emotionally it's more complicated." That night, I lay awake thinking about Patricia's request. I thought about the scared little girl I'd been, desperate for her approval. I thought about the years of criticism, the emotional distance, the way she'd deliberately hurt me on my wedding day. But I also thought about the small kindnesses she'd shown me over the years, the way she'd helped me with homework and driven me to school activities, even if she'd done it grudgingly. Most of all, I thought about the woman I wanted to be, versus the woman Patricia's treatment had tried to make me. Did I want to be someone who could walk away from a person in desperate need, even if that person had hurt me? Or did I want to be better than that, to show the compassion and strength that Patricia had never been able to give me? The answer, when it came, surprised me with its clarity. I was going to get tested. The medical testing began 3 weeks later at Portland General Hospital. I sat in the sterile waiting room, filling out forms that asked detailed questions about my medical history, lifestyle, and motivations for wanting to donate. David had taken the morning off work to come with me, his steady presence a comfort as I navigated this surreal situation. Dr. Rachel Martinez, the transplant coordinator, was a kind woman in her 40s who explained the process with patience and thoroughness. "Living donor kidney transplantation is major surgery for both the donor and recipient," she said as we sat in her office. "We need to make absolutely certain that you're physically and psychologically prepared for what this entails. The initial blood work would determine if Patricia and I were compatible. If that hurdle was cleared, I'd undergo weeks of additional testing, including CT scans, psychological evaluations, and meetings with social workers to ensure I understood the risks and wasn't being coerced into donating." "How long before we know if I'm a match?" I asked. "The basic compatibility results should be ready in about a week," Dr. Martinez said. "But the entire evaluation process takes 6 to 8 weeks if you decide to move forward." As the nurse drew my blood, I wondered if I was making a terrible mistake. Part of me hoped the tests would show we weren't compatible, making the decision for me. Another part was terrified that we would be a perfect match, forcing me to confront the depths of my complicated feelings about Patricia. That evening, Margaret called to check on me. I'd told my biological family about Patricia's diagnosis and my decision to be tested, though I'd left out many of the painful details of our relationship. Margaret had been supportive but concerned. "Are you sure about this, sweetheart?" she asked. "I know you feel obligated to help her, but you don't owe that woman anything after how she treated you." "I know," I said, curled up on my couch with David's arm around me, "but I need to know I did everything I could. If I don't at least try to help her and she dies, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have saved her." Margaret sighed. "You have a bigger heart than she deserves. Linda would be proud of the woman you've become." The mention of my biological mother brought tears to my eyes. Over the past 3 years, Margaret had shared countless stories about Linda, helping me piece together an image of a woman who had loved me fiercely despite her struggles. Sometimes I wondered what my life would have been like if Linda had survived, if I'd grown up surrounded by Margaret and my cousins instead of walking on eggshells around Patricia. The compatibility results came back positive. Not only were Patricia and I a match, but according to Dr. Martinez, we were an exceptionally good one. Your tissue types are remarkably similar, she explained during our follow-up appointment. This level of compatibility usually only occurs between siblings or parent and child. The irony wasn't lost on me. Despite not being biologically related, despite Patricia spending years emphasizing how I wasn't really her daughter, our bodies were perfectly suited to help each other. It felt like the universe was playing some cosmic joke. What happens next? David asked. If Sarah decides to proceed, we'll schedule the comprehensive donor evaluation, Dr. Martinez said. This includes extensive medical testing, psychological counseling, and meetings with our ethics committee. We want to make absolutely sure she's making this decision freely and understands all the risks involved. I looked at David, who squeezed my hand encouragingly. I want to continue with the testing, I said. The next phase was exhausting. I spent hours at the hospital undergoing every test imaginable. They scanned my kidneys, tested my heart function, analyzed my blood chemistry, and even had me meet with a psychiatrist to assess my mental state. Each appointment felt like peeling back another layer of my psyche, forcing me to examine my motivations and fears. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the psychiatrist assigned to my case, was particularly thorough. During our third session, she asked the question I'd been dreading. "Tell me about your relationship with Patricia," she said, her pen poised over her notepad. I'd been trying to present a sanitized version of our history, focusing on the practical aspects of our relationship rather than the emotional damage. But Dr. Walsh was too perceptive to be fooled by surface-level responses. "It's complicated," I said. "Most family relationships are, but I need to understand the dynamics at play here. Are you donating out of love, obligation, guilt, or some other motivation?" The question hung in the air between us. I stared out the window at the hospital parking lot, watching people come and go, all of them dealing with their own medical crises and family dramas. "She was never a warm person," I said finally. "Even as a child, I knew something was different about our relationship compared to my friends and their mothers. She provided for me, made sure I had what I needed, but there was always this emotional distance." "When did you learn about your adoption status?" "I was never actually adopted," I corrected. "I remained her foster child until I aged out of the system. And I found out on my wedding day, 3 years ago." Dr. Walsh's eyebrows raised slightly. "That must have been difficult timing." I laughed bitterly. "That's one way to put it. She chose that moment specifically because she knew it would hurt the most. And yet you're here, willing to undergo major surgery to save her life. Help me understand that." I thought about how to explain the tangle of emotions that had led me to this point. "I think part of it is that I want to be a better person than she is. I want to show compassion even when it hasn't been shown to me. But honestly, Dr. Walsh, I'm also terrified of the guilt I'd feel if she died and I could have prevented it. Even after everything she's put you through. Especially because of everything she's put you through," I said. "I've spent my entire life trying to be good enough for her approval. Maybe this is just another version of that same pattern." Dr. Walsh made notes on her pad. "Have you considered that donating a kidney might not actually earn you the relationship you've always wanted with her?" The question hit me like a slap. "What do you mean?" "People's fundamental personalities don't usually change, even in the face of life-threatening illness. If Patricia has been emotionally unavailable and critical your entire life, receiving your kidney isn't likely to suddenly make her the loving, grateful mother you've always wanted." I sat in silence, absorbing the truth of her words. Deep down I knew she was right, but I'd been holding on to a fantasy that saving Patricia's life would somehow heal our broken relationship. "So you think I shouldn't donate?" I asked. "I think you should donate for the right reasons, not because you're hoping to finally win her love. That's setting yourself up for disappointment and resentment." That night, I shared Dr. Walsh's insights with David over dinner. He listened thoughtfully as I recounted the conversation, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me work through my feelings out loud. "Do you think she's right?" I asked him. "Am I just setting myself up for more disappointment?" David was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I think Dr. Walsh makes a valid point about managing your expectations, but I also think you're capable of making this decision for reasons that have nothing to do with Patricia's approval. What do you mean? You're one of the most compassionate people I know, Sarah. You work at a nonprofit helping families in crisis. You volunteer at the animal shelter every weekend. You send birthday cards to elderly residents at the nursing home near Margaret's house. You help people because it's who you are, not because you expect something in return. His words brought tears to my eyes. But this feels different. This is Patricia. It is different, he agreed. It's harder because of your history with her. But maybe that's exactly why you should do it. Not to win her love, but to prove to yourself that you can rise above the pain she's caused you. The psychological evaluation continued for 2 more weeks. Dr. Walsh pushed me to examine every aspect of my decision, ensuring I understood the physical risks and emotional complexities involved. By the end of our sessions, I felt more confident about my motivations and more realistic about my expectations. I'm going to recommend you for donation, Dr. Walsh said during our final meeting. But I want you to promise me something. After the surgery, regardless of how Patricia responds, I want you to come back and see me. This kind of experience can bring up unexpected emotions, and I want to make sure you have support. Meanwhile, the physical testing revealed that I was in excellent health and would be an ideal donor. My kidneys were functioning perfectly, my cardiovascular system was strong, and I had no underlying conditions that would complicate surgery or recovery. You're a perfect candidate, Dr. Martinez told me during our final evaluation meeting. Your kidney function is excellent, and all your other systems are healthy. If you decide to proceed, we can schedule the surgery for next month. Next month. Suddenly the abstract concept of donation became concrete and immediate. In 4 weeks, I would be lying on an operating table having one of my organs removed and given to the woman who had spent my childhood making me feel unwanted. I need a few days to make my final decision, I told her. That weekend, David and I drove to the coast for a long weekend getaway. We walked on the beach, ate fresh seafood, and talked endlessly about the decision ahead of me. Being away from the hospital and the weight of medical appointments helped me think more clearly. What scares you most about the surgery? David asked as we sat on a log watching the sunset on our last evening there. Honestly, I'm scared that I'll go through all of this, risk my health, endure weeks of recovery, and Patricia will go right back to treating me like I'm nothing to her. I'm scared I'll feel like an idiot for thinking this would change anything between us. David nodded. Those are valid fears. But let me ask you something else. If Patricia died tomorrow and you hadn't tried to help her, how would you feel? The question made my stomach clench. Horrible, guilty, like I'd failed some fundamental test of human decency. And if you donate your kidney and she goes back to being cold and distant afterward? I thought about it. I'd be hurt, but I think I'd also be at peace with myself. I'd know I did everything I could. Then you have your answer. On Monday morning, I called Dr. Martinez and scheduled the surgery for 3 weeks later. The news sent me into a flurry of practical preparations. I arranged for extended medical leave from work, stocked our freezer with prepared meals for my recovery period, and made sure all our bills were set up for automatic payment since I'd be unable to handle household tasks for several weeks. Patricia and I had barely spoken during the evaluation process. She'd called once a week to check on my progress, but our conversations were brief and awkward. Neither of us seemed to know how to navigate this strange new dynamic, where she needed something from me and I held all the power. 2 weeks before the surgery, she asked to meet with me. We arranged to have coffee at a neutral location, a small cafe downtown, where we'd never been together before. I arrived first and chose a table near the back, away from the lunch crowd and curious ears. Patricia looked better than she had the night she'd first told me about her diagnosis. The doctors had started her on treatments to help manage her symptoms while she waited for a transplant, and some of the gray pallor had left her skin. But she was still thinner than I'd ever seen her, and I could tell the illness was taking its toll. "Thank you for agreeing to do this," she said, after we'd ordered our drinks. It was the closest thing to gratitude I'd ever heard from her. "You don't need to thank me," I said. "I'm not doing this for thanks." She stirred her coffee nervously. "I know this can't be easy for you given our history. Our history," Such a sanitized way to describe 25 years of emotional distance and cruelty. No, it's not easy, I agreed, but it's the right thing to do. Patricia looked up from her coffee, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes that might have been regret. Sarah, I know I haven't been the mother you deserved. I know I've said and done things that hurt you. My heart began to race. Was this the moment I'd waited my entire life for? Was she finally going to acknowledge the damage she'd caused and apologize for it? I was young when you came to live with me, she continued. I was dealing with my own problems, my divorce, financial stress. I wasn't prepared to be a single mother, especially to a child who had already experienced trauma. I waited for her to continue, for the apology I desperately wanted to hear. I did the best I could with what I had, she said instead. I know it wasn't perfect, but I provided for you, gave you stability, made sure you had opportunities I never had. The disappointment was crushing. Even facing major surgery and dependent on my goodwill, Patricia couldn't bring herself to admit she'd been wrong or cruel. She was still justifying her behavior, still making excuses, still unable to take responsibility for the emotional damage she'd inflicted. I see, I said quietly. I hope you can understand that, she pressed. I hope you can forgive me for not being the mother you wanted. The mother I wanted, not the mother I deserved, not the mother any child deserved, but the mother I had unreasonably wanted. Even her request for forgiveness was backhanded, implying that my expectations had been too high rather than her treatment being too harsh. I understand that you did what you thought was right, I said carefully. And I forgive you for not being perfect. It wasn't the conversation either of us had hoped for, but it was probably the best we were going to get. Patricia seemed relieved that I'd offered forgiveness, even if it wasn't for the right reasons. I was disappointed but not surprised that she couldn't offer a genuine apology, even now. The week before surgery, my biological family rallied around me in ways that highlighted just how different love could look. Margaret took vacation days to help me prepare, cooking meals to freeze and organizing my medications. My cousins called daily to check on me and offer support. Even relatives I barely knew sent cards and flowers, expressing their admiration for what I was doing and their concern for my well-being. You don't have to do this, you know, my cousin James said during a visit. He was Margaret's eldest, then a man in his 30s, who had become like a big brother to me over the past 3 years. Even if you've committed to it, even if the surgery is scheduled, you can still change your mind. I know, I said, but I don't want to. Even knowing she'll probably go right back to treating you badly afterward. I'd been asking myself the same question for weeks. I'm not doing this to change her, James. I'm doing it because it's who I want to be. The night before surgery, David and I lay in bed talking quietly. Neither of us was sleeping well, anxiety and anticipation keeping us both awake despite our exhaustion. Are you scared? He asked, his arm tightening around me. Terrified, I admitted. Not just of the surgery, but of everything that comes after. What if something goes wrong? What if the kidney doesn't work for her? What if I have complications? The doctors say the risks are minimal, he reminded me. You're young and healthy, you're going to be fine. What if I'm not? What if this is a huge mistake? David was quiet for a moment. Then we'll deal with whatever happens together. But Sarah, I want you to know something. Regardless of how this turns out, regardless of how Patricia responds, I'm proud of you for making this choice. It takes incredible courage and compassion to help someone who's hurt you. His words meant everything to me. Whatever happened in the operating room tomorrow, whatever Patricia's response was to receiving my kidney, I would always have David's love and respect. I would always have the knowledge that I'd chosen kindness over bitterness, hope over cynicism. Surgery was scheduled for 7 in the morning. David drove me to the hospital in the pre-dawn darkness, both of us quiet and nervous. The streets were empty, except for other early commuters heading to jobs that required them to be up before sunrise. I wondered how many of them were facing their own life-changing moments, their own impossible decisions. In the pre-operative area, I changed into a hospital gown and was wheeled into a room where Patricia was already waiting. She looked small and vulnerable in her own hospital bed. IV lines running into her arms, her hair covered by a surgical cap. For a moment, she looked like any frightened patient facing major surgery, and I felt a surge of compassion for her that had nothing to do with our complicated history. "How are you feeling?" she asked, when she saw me. "Nervous," I admitted. "You the same." She paused, seeming to struggle with something she wanted to say. "Sarah, I want you to know that I'm grateful for what you're doing, more grateful than I know how to express." It wasn't the heartfelt apology or declaration of love I'd always hoped for, but it was more than she'd ever given me before. "Thank you for saying that," I said. Dr. Harrison, the surgeon who would be removing my kidney, stopped by to explain the procedure one final time and answer any last-minute questions. "The surgery typically takes about 3 hours," he said. "You'll be in recovery for several hours after that, and if everything goes well, you'll be discharged in 2 to 3 days. And Patricia, her surgery will be slightly longer since we're implanting the kidney, but she should be discharged within a week, if there are no complications." The anesthesiologist arrived to start my IV and explain what would happen when I went under. As he worked, I looked around the room at the faces of the medical team who would be taking care of us. These strangers were about to perform a miracle, moving a part of my body into Patricia's, and hopefully giving her years more life. "Any last words before we head to the OR?" Dr. Harrison asked with a gentle smile. I looked at Patricia, lying in her bed preparing to receive a gift she'd never asked for from a daughter she'd never really claimed. Despite everything between us, despite the years of pain and disappointment, I was about to give her the most precious thing I could offer. "Just that I hope this works," I said. "I hope it gives you the chance to live the life you want." Patricia's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her in years. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving my life." As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I closed my eyes and tried to quiet the storm of emotions in my chest. Whatever happened next, whatever Patricia's recovery brought, whatever our relationship looked like going forward, I knew I was making the right choice. I was choosing love over resentment, hope over bitterness, compassion over self-protection. The operating room was blindingly bright and filled with more people than I'd expected. Surgeons, nurses, anesthesiologists, and technicians all moved around me with practiced efficiency, checking equipment, and preparing for the procedure that would change both Patricia's life and mine forever. "Count backward from 10 for me, Sarah," the anesthesiologist said, adjusting something on the IV line connected to my arm. 10, 9, 8. I began, and then the world faded to black. I woke up to the soft beeping of machines, and a dull ache in my left side that felt like someone had taken a baseball bat to my ribs. The recovery room was dimly lit, and it took me several moments to remember where I was, and why every breath sent sharp pain through my torso. "There she is," a cheerful voice said. A nurse appeared beside my bed, checking the monitors connected to various parts of my body. "How are you feeling, honey?" "Like I got hit by a truck," I croaked, my throat raw from the breathing tube. "That's normal after surgery. Your kidney is already on its way to help someone very important to you." The procedure went perfectly. Patricia, in my post-anesthesia fog, I'd momentarily forgotten why I was here. "How is she? Did everything go okay with her surgery?" The nurse smiled. "I can't give you specific details about another patient, but I can tell you that both surgeries were successful. You should be very proud of what you've done." Over the next few hours, the fog gradually lifted, replaced by waves of pain that the morphine could only partially mask. David appeared at some point, his face creased with worry and relief. He held my hand while I drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling reassurances that I was going to be fine. Dr. Harrison visited the next morning, examining my incisions and checking my vital signs with practiced efficiency. "Everything looks excellent," he said. "Your remaining kidney is functioning perfectly, and you're healing well. We should have you up and walking this afternoon." "When can I see Patricia?" He hesitated. "She's still in intensive care while we monitor the new kidney. The next 48 hours are critical for making sure her body accepts the transplant, but I can tell you that early signs are very encouraging." By the afternoon of my second day, I was walking slowly around the hospital corridors with David's support, each step a reminder of what I'd given up to save the woman who had never truly accepted me as her daughter. Other patients and their families smiled at us as we passed, probably assuming we were just another normal couple dealing with routine medical issues. They had no idea of the complex emotional minefield that had led us here. Margaret arrived that evening with flowers and homemade soup, her eyes red from crying. I can't believe you actually went through with it, she said, embracing me carefully to avoid my incisions. You're braver than I could ever be. Or more stupid, I said with a weak laugh. Not stupid. Compassionate, there's a difference. She settled into the chair beside my bed. Have you heard how she's doing? The doctors say the surgery went well, but they're being careful about sharing details. Something about patient privacy. Margaret nodded, though I could see the questions in her eyes that she was too polite to ask. She'd never understood why I felt compelled to help Patricia, and I suspected she was worried about how this would all end. On my third day, Dr. Martinez finally gave me permission to visit Patricia. She was in a private room 2 floors up, surrounded by machines that monitored her heart rate, blood pressure, and kidney function. The new organ, my organ, was already working inside her body, filtering toxins and producing urine in a steady rhythm that the nurses celebrated as a sign of success. Patricia looked smaller than ever in the hospital bed, her skin still pale, but with a healthier undertone than I'd seen in months. She was awake when I entered, staring out the window at the city skyline. "Hi," I said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned toward me, and for a moment, I saw something in her expression that I'd never seen before. Vulnerability, maybe, or genuine gratitude. "Sarah, you came." "Of course I came. How are you feeling?" "Different," she said, her voice hoarse. "The doctors say your kidney is working perfectly. Better than my original ones have worked in years." She paused, seeming to struggle with her next words.
I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. I pulled the visitor's chair closer to her bed, moving carefully to avoid pulling at my stitches. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad you're okay. But I do need to thank you. And I need to say other things. Things I should have said years ago." Patricia's eyes filled with tears, and I felt my heart begin to race with the possibility that this might finally be the conversation I'd waited my entire life to have. "I was a terrible mother to you," she continued, her voice breaking. "I was cold and distant and cruel. And you deserved so much better than what I gave you." The words I'd longed to hear hung in the air between us. After 25 years, Patricia was finally acknowledging the truth of our relationship, finally admitting that she'd failed me in fundamental ways. "When Linda brought you to me, you were this broken little thing, so scared and needy. I thought I could fix you, turn you into the perfect daughter I'd always imagined having. But every time you cried or clung to me, or asked about your real mother, I felt like a failure. Instead of getting help for both of us, I just got colder and more resentful." I sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down my face as Patricia continued her confession. "I convinced myself that providing for you was enough, that keeping you fed and clothed and educated made me a good mother. I ignored the fact that you were desperate for affection, for reassurance that you were wanted and loved. I failed you in every way that mattered." "Patricia," I started, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish, please. I need to say this while I have the courage." She took a shaky breath. "What I told you on your wedding day was unforgivable. I was angry and hurt that you were leaving, that you'd found happiness with David, and I wanted to hurt you back. So I used the cruelest weapon I had, the truth about your origins, and I used it at the moment when it would cause you the most pain." The memory of that day came flooding back, standing in my wedding dress while Patricia shattered my world with casual cruelty. But now, hearing her acknowledge it, some of the old wound began to feel like it might actually heal. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so deeply, profoundly sorry for all of it. For being cold when you needed warmth. For being critical when you needed encouragement. For making you feel unwanted when you deserved to be cherished. You were never the problem. I was." I couldn't speak through my tears. This was the apology I'd dreamed of receiving, the acknowledgement of pain that I'd needed for decades. But it was also coming at a moment when I'd already begun to heal, when I'd found real family with Margaret and my cousins, when I'd learned what genuine love looked like through David's eyes. "I don't expect your forgiveness," Patricia continued. "I know I don't deserve it after everything I've put you through. But I needed you to know that I see it now. I understand how badly I damaged you, and I'm grateful beyond words that you became such an incredible person despite having me as a mother. I do forgive you," I said quietly, the words coming from some deep well of compassion I'd been afraid to tap into. "I forgave you before I even decided to give you my kidney. I had to for my own sake." Patricia reached for my hand, and I let her take it. Her fingers were cold and thin, but her grip was surprisingly strong. You saved my life in more ways than one, she said. This kidney will give me years I wouldn't have had. But more than that, it's given me a chance to try to make things right between us. Over the following days, as we both recovered from our surgeries, Patricia and I had more honest conversations than we'd had in my entire life. She told me about her own childhood, growing up with a mother who had been emotionally distant and a father who drank too much. She talked about her marriage to Robert, how his abandonment had left her feeling worthless and afraid of being hurt again. I know it's not an excuse, she said, during one of our talks. My own pain doesn't justify the pain I caused you. But I want you to understand that I wasn't capable of giving you what you needed, because I'd never learned how to give or receive love in a healthy way. I found myself feeling compassion for the young woman Patricia had been struggling with her own trauma, while trying to raise a damaged child. It didn't erase the years of hurt, but it helped me understand them in a new context. The kidney transplant was a complete success. Within a week, Patricia's energy levels had improved dramatically, and her color had returned to normal. The doctors were amazed at how well her body had accepted my organ, joking that we must have been related after all, given how perfectly matched we were. David and I were discharged on the same day, both of us moving slowly but healing well. Margaret had volunteered to stay with us for the first week to help with household tasks. I couldn't manage while recovering, and her presence filled our small apartment with the kind of nurturing energy I'd always craved. How do you feel about everything now? David asked one evening as we sat on the couch, careful not to jostle our healing incisions. Any regrets? I thought about the question seriously. The physical recovery was harder than I'd expected, and I'd likely deal with some level of increased medical monitoring for the rest of my life. But emotionally I felt lighter than I had in years. No regrets, I said. Even if Patricia hadn't apologized, even if she'd gone right back to being cold and distant, I think I would still feel good about what we did. It was the right thing to do, and now that she has apologized, I considered that. Patricia's apology had been everything I'd ever wanted to hear, but it had also come too late to fundamentally change our relationship. Too much damage had been done, too many years had passed. We might be able to build something new going forward, but we'd never have the mother-daughter bond I'd once desperately wanted. It helps, I said finally. It gives me closure on a lot of old pain, but I think I'd already started healing before she said anything. Finding Margaret and my biological family, marrying you, building a life based on the love I deserved, rather than the love I'd been denied. That's what really saved me. Patricia was discharged a few days later, her recovery progressing even faster than the doctors had expected. She called me every few days to check on my healing and share updates about her own progress. The conversations were still somewhat awkward, neither of us quite sure how to navigate this new dynamic, but they were warmer than any exchanges we'd had in years. 3 weeks after the surgery, she invited David and me to dinner at her house. It was the first time I'd been back since the night she'd told me about needing a kidney, and walking through the door brought back a flood of complicated memories. Patricia had prepared my favorite meal, chicken parmesan with garlic bread, something she hadn't made for me since I was a teenager. The gesture was small but meaningful, an acknowledgement of preferences and memories she'd previously dismissed as unimportant. You look good, I told her as we sat down to eat. It was true. The grayish pallor that had shadowed her face for months was completely gone, replaced by healthy pink cheeks and bright eyes. I feel better than I have in years, she said. The doctors say your kidney is functioning at 100%. It's like having a whole new life. During dinner she asked about my work, about David's recent promotion, about Margaret and my cousins. For the first time in my memory, she seemed genuinely interested in my life, rather than just going through the motions of polite conversation. I've been thinking, she said as we cleared the dishes, about what I want to do with this second chance you've given me. I want to make up for lost time, if you'll let me. What do you mean? I mean I want to try to be the mother I should have been all along. I know I can't undo the past, but maybe I can do better going forward. It was a lovely sentiment, and I could see that she meant it. But I'd learned too much about healthy relationships in the past few years to put too much pressure on this fragile new beginning. I'd like that, I said carefully, but I think we need to take it slow, build trust gradually. Too much pressure to be perfect might just set us both up for disappointment. Patricia nodded, and I was relieved to see understanding rather than hurt in her eyes. You're right.
You've always been wiser than I gave you credit for. Over the following months, Patricia and I built a cautious new relationship. She remembered my birthday for the first time in years, sending a thoughtful card and a gift certificate to my favorite bookstore. She called regularly, not just to check on my post-surgery health, but to share details about her own life and ask about mine. When David got his promotion, she took us out to dinner to celebrate. The changes weren't dramatic or Hollywood perfect. We didn't suddenly become the close mother-daughter pair I'd dreamed of as a child. But we became something we'd never been before. Two adults who cared about each other's well-being and made an effort to show it. Margaret watched this development with cautious optimism. "I'm glad she's trying," she said during one of our weekly coffee dates. "But don't lose sight of the fact that you're a complete person with or without her approval. You've built a beautiful life surrounded by people who love you unconditionally." She was right, of course. The most important healing in my life had happened before Patricia's kidney failure forced this confrontation between us. Learning about Linda, finding Margaret and my biological family, marrying David, those were the experiences that had taught me what real love looked like. Patricia's apology and efforts to change were meaningful, but they weren't the foundation of my happiness anymore. 6 months after the surgery, I received an unexpected phone call from Patricia. "I have something I want to show you," she said. "Can you come over this weekend?" When David and I arrived at her house, she led us to her guest room, which she'd converted into an office. The walls were covered with photo albums I'd never seen before, chronicling my entire life from the day I'd arrived at her door as a 3-year-old through my college graduation. "I kept all of this," she said, gesturing to the displays. "Pictures, school reports, art projects, everything. I just never knew how to share it with you, how to admit that I'd been documenting your life, because despite everything, you mattered to me." I walked around the room, taking in images of my younger self at birthday parties, school plays, and family gatherings. In many of the photos, Patricia was smiling genuinely, looking proud of me in ways I'd never felt from her at the time. It was like seeing a parallel version of my childhood, one where I'd been loved even when that love wasn't properly expressed. "Why didn't you ever show me this before?" I asked. Patricia's face crumpled slightly. "Because I was ashamed. Ashamed that I'd been too proud, or too scared to tell you how proud of you I was. It was easier to pretend I didn't care, than to risk being vulnerable." The revelation was bittersweet. All those years when I'd thought Patricia was indifferent to my achievements, she'd actually been quietly celebrating them. All those times I'd felt invisible in my own home, she'd been documenting my presence because it mattered to her. Her emotional unavailability hadn't been evidence that I was unworthy of love. It had been evidence that she didn't know how to love in a way that I could recognize. That night, David and I stayed up late talking about the visit. "How do you feel about finding out she cared all along?" he asked. "Sad," I said honestly. "Sad for both of us. Sad for the relationship we could have had if she'd been brave enough to show her feelings. Sad for the little girl I was, who needed to see that love so desperately. But also grateful," I continued. "Grateful that we found our way to honesty, even if it took a life-threatening crisis to get there. Grateful that I was able to help her, and that it opened the door for us to finally understand each other." A year after the transplant surgery, Patricia and I met for lunch at a restaurant downtown. She looked healthier than I'd ever seen her, with color in her cheeks and energy in her movements that spoke to the gift of functioning kidneys. We talked about work, about David's latest project, about Margaret's recent retirement. "I have something to tell you," Patricia said as we finished our meal. "I've been seeing a therapist." I nearly choked on my iced tea. "You have?" She nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "Dr. Walsh, actually. The psychiatrist from your donor evaluation." I asked her if she'd be willing to work with me on understanding why I struggled so much with being your mother. It's been eye-opening. The idea of Patricia voluntarily seeking therapy to address her parenting failures was so unexpected that I needed a moment to process it. "What made you decide to do that?" Realizing that I'd wasted 25 years being too proud and too scared to love you the way you deserved. "I don't want to waste whatever time we have left." She paused, fidgeting with her napkin. "Dr. Walsh has helped me understand that my own childhood trauma made it hard for me to bond with you, especially knowing that you'd already experienced loss and abandonment. I was so afraid of not being good enough that I stopped trying to be good at all."
Her willingness to examine her own behavior and work to change it meant more to me than any of her previous apologies. It showed a level of commitment to our relationship that I'd never expected from her. "How do you feel about the therapy?" I asked. "Uncomfortable, most of the time," she admitted with a rueful smile. "But also hopeful. For the first time in my life, I feel like I might be able to learn how to love people better, how to show care instead of just feeling it privately." We parted that day with a hug, something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. As I drove home, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. I'd given Patricia one of my kidneys, not because she deserved it, but because I needed to know I was capable of that kind of compassion. In return, I'd received something I'd stopped believing was possible, a genuine relationship with the woman who raised me. It wasn't the fairy tale reconciliation that movies promised, where all wounds heal completely, and everyone lives happily ever after. We were still two damaged people learning how to care for each other properly, still navigating the aftermath of decades of miscommunication and emotional distance. But we were trying, both of us, to build something better than what we'd started with. The kidney transplant had saved Patricia's life, but the real miracle was that it had also saved our relationship. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't what they need to survive, but what they need to grow into the person they're meant to be. In helping Patricia live, I'd helped both of us learn how to love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.